On the morning of April 16, 1947, the port of Texas City was already awake. Men were loading cargo, trains rattled in the distance, seagulls circled above the docks, waiting for scraps. Nothing about that morning felt dangerous. The water was calm, the sky was open, the work was routine, the kind of routine you stop noticing once it's been your entire life.
What no one on the waterfront could know was that a ship sitting quietly in the harbor had already become a bomb. If you want to understand how an ordinary morning turned into one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history, stay with this story. Texas City wasn't just a town near the water, it was a town built around what came through the water. In 1947, the port was the city's heartbeat, ships arriving, cargo moving, factories running, paychecks earned.
And like any heartbeat, it was easiest to ignore until something went wrong. Down near the docks, a dock worker we'll call Ray stepped onto the pier and adjusted his cap against the wind. He'd been working these docks long enough to stop thinking about danger. Not because it didn't exist, but because danger, when it's part of the background, becomes normal. Ray had a family, he had bills, he had a shift. He didn't wake up that morning expecting history. Not far from the port, a woman we'll call Evelyn rinsed dishes in a small kitchen, window cracked open to let in air that smelled faintly of salt and industry. Her husband worked near the industrial shoreline, one of thousands whose lives were tied to the port. Evelyn's world was ordinary: chores, groceries, the day's plan. She could hear a train horn somewhere in the distance and barely noticed. In a nearby neighborhood, kids were getting ready for school. Lunch pails, buttons. The small arguments that happen in every household. A teacher, somewhere, was writing on a chalkboard, not knowing the day would become something no lesson could cover. And at the port, ships sat in the water like they always did. One of them was the Grandcamp. To most people in Texas City, it was just another cargo ship. Steel hull, crane lines, workers moving around it like ants around a machine. Ships came and went. It was nothing worth looking at twice. But inside the Grandcamp was a cargo that didn't behave like ordinary cargo. It was ammonium nitrate, commonly described as fertilizer, something that made crops grow. And in many contexts, that's exactly what it was: a product.
A shipment, a line item. But ammonium nitrate has another identity, one that only becomes visible under the wrong conditions. It can feed fire from within, and when heated and confined, it can transform into something violent. The people on the docks weren't chemists. They weren't thinking in equations or hazard charts. They were thinking in schedules and procedures, and the simple belief that today would be like yesterday. That belief is what makes the beginning of this story so unsettling.
Because everything looked normal, right up until it didn't. The first sign was smoke. Not a towering plume, not a dramatic blaze, just smoke coming from inside the Grandcamp's hold. Thin at first, easy to dismiss. A small fire on a ship wasn't unheard of. Cargo could smolder, equipment could malfunction. Sometimes it was careless handling, sometimes it was bad luck. Either way, the first reaction wasn't panic. It was routine. Workers moved closer. Someone called for help.
Someone fetched equipment. Firefighters were alerted. And the scene began to draw attention. That's what anomalies do. They pull people in. Along the shoreline, people noticed the smoke and stopped. Some pointed. Some walked toward the water. In a port town, a ship fire felt like a spectacle, not a threat. It was something to watch from a safe distance, something different in an otherwise ordinary day. And the smoke. It wasn't just smoke.
It carried an unusual color, a strange tint in the haze, enough to trigger curiosity. More people gathered. Men on break, women holding children, teenagers leaning forward. People who felt protected simply because they weren't standing on the deck. Firefighters arrived and did what firefighters always do. They moved toward the problem. The goal was to extinguish the fire without ruining the cargo.
That detail matters because it reveals the mindset of the moment. Protect the shipment.
Protect the work. Keep the system functioning. So instead of flooding the hold with water, there was an attempt to control the fire in a way that seemed reasonable for the time. Steam. The idea was to smother the fire by displacing oxygen. Seal the hold, pump in steam, starve the flames. In many situations, that approach could work. But here's what the people on the dock couldn't see. The cargo itself could feed combustion.
And heating ammonium nitrate inside a confined space is not just fighting a fire. It can be building pressure, building heat, building the conditions for a detonation. But the fire still looked manageable. The crowd still watched. And then, almost like the world was leaning into the moment, someone said, quietly at first, then louder, "It's getting worse." The smoke thickened, the air shifted, the dock felt tense. And still, nobody ran, because this wasn't panic yet. It was curiosity. At 9:12 a.m., the Grandcamp stopped being a ship. It happened faster than thought. A violent release of energy, so sudden that many people close to the docks didn't even hear it as a sound. They experienced it as force, as pressure, as the air turning solid for an instant and slamming into bodies, buildings, and glass. The ship detonated. Steel became fragments, metal became projectiles, the dock was shredded. A crater opened where the Grandcamp had been. The blast wave traveled outward, through warehouses, through rail cars, through streets. Windows shattered miles away. Doors blew inward. Roofs lifted. The harbor water surged, thrown upward, and then collapsing back in a violent crash. A massive cloud rose over Texas City, dark and towering, visible from far beyond the shoreline. In that first moment, the city didn't understand what had happened. Some thought it was an airplane. Others thought it was an attack. Some believed the war had returned. The scale didn't fit any normal category of accident. Near the docks, firefighters who had moved closer to the ship were caught in the direct blast zone. Many never had a chance. Along the shoreline, the crowd that had gathered to watch, people who had come out of curiosity, were suddenly in the path of force that did not care why they were there. The blast did what blasts do. It erased, it threw, it broke. And then came a kind of silence. Not total silence. Fires and alarms began almost immediately, but a stunned pause where the mind tries to process an impossible shift. In seconds, the port became chaos. Warehouses burned, fuel sources ignited, rail cars caught fire. Industrial structures were damaged in ways no one could fully see yet. And somewhere in that smoke and flame, another ship sat docked, the High Flyer, also carrying ammonium nitrate. And now it was burning too. Texas City had just been hit once. And the city didn't know it yet, but the disaster was about to become a chain reaction. The injuries came in waves. People emerged from buildings with blood on their faces from shattered windows. Some were cut, some were burned, some were in shock so deep they moved without emotion, as if their bodies were walking while their minds stayed behind. Hospitals, never designed for mass casualties, filled beyond capacity. Patients lined hallways. Volunteers carried stretchers. Nurses worked without rest. Doctors treated injuries in whatever space existed. Supplies ran low. Information was fragmented. In disasters, the absence of coordination becomes its own kind of threat. Families began searching. Evelyn moved through streets covered in glass and debris, trying to find news of her husband. Phones didn't work reliably. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Someone said the blast had killed everyone on the dock. Someone said more ships were at risk. Someone said evacuate. Someone said stay. Every rumor carried a different fear. People gathered at churches, schools, community buildings.
anywhere that might become a center of information. Names were written down, repeated, spoken aloud. Who's missing? That phrase became a constant. At the port, responders, many of them volunteers now, tried to contain fires that were spreading across an industrial zone filled with fuel, chemicals, and infrastructure designed for efficiency, not catastrophe.
The city's identity changed in real time. Texas City didn't look like a working port town anymore. It looked like a war zone. And the worst part was the uncertainty. Because fires were still burning, smoke still rolled over the shoreline, and the high flyer continued to smolder, its cargo heated for hours. The first explosion had shattered the city. Now the city lived under the fear of a second one.
As afternoon turned to evening, evacuation became uneven. Some left, some stayed, some didn't hear warnings, some refused because leaving felt like abandoning missing loved ones. And as darkness arrived, the glow over the harbor became brighter, an unnatural light on the horizon, pulsing behind smoke clouds. The city waited, not calmly, but helplessly, because everyone had learned the same lesson that morning. A ship can become a bomb. And now, another ship was burning.
After the explosions, America asked a question that always follows disasters of this scale. How could this happen? The instinct was to find one cause, one mistake, one decision, one person to blame. But disasters like Texas City don't come from one failure. They come from systems. A dangerous cargo treated as ordinary. Procedures designed for normal fires applied to an abnormal chemical risk. Industrial zones built close together, so one ignition point becomes many. Crowds drawn in by curiosity because the danger didn't look like danger yet. Texas City became a national reference point because it exposed a truth about modern life. The same industrial system that supports prosperity also carries hidden triggers. Ammonium nitrate existed across the country, in ports, warehouses, rail cars, farms. Most of the time, nothing happened. That nothing created false safety. It allowed routine to harden into habit. Texas City broke that habit, not theoretically. In the wake of the disaster, conversations changed about labeling, handling, storage, transport, training, and emergency response readiness. It sharpened awareness that fertilizer could become something else under the wrong conditions. It also forced communities to confront something uncomfortable. Local emergency systems are not built for industrial catastrophes of this magnitude. Volunteer firefighters can respond to house fires. But an industrial disaster involving chemical cargo and massive explosions demands regional planning, specialized equipment, and protocols designed for hazards that do not behave like normal fires. Texas City also made America look at proximity, how close hazardous industry sits to neighborhoods, how efficiently ports are built, and how quickly efficiency becomes vulnerability. Because what happened wasn't just a tragedy. It was a domino effect. A chain reaction in the physical world, and then a chain reaction in how America thought about risk. The country moved forward, as countries do, but it didn't move forward unchanged. When the fires finally faded, Texas City rebuilt. The port returned to work. Ships arrived again. The shoreline looked functional again, at least from a distance. But normal didn't mean what it meant before. Because after a disaster like this, the world becomes divided into two timelines. Before you learned how fragile modern life can be, and after. People carried the memory in quiet ways, in how they reacted to smoke on the horizon, in how they listened to sirens, in how they taught children that some ordinary things deserve respect. Texas City mattered because it wasn't a story of malice. It was a story of routine meeting risk, a story of a system underestimating its own materials until the materials taught the lesson for it. And the lesson was simple and heavy. The modern world is powerful,
but not invincible. A normal morning can become history in seconds. And when it does, the most valuable thing left isn't steel, or cargo, or industry. It's the people who show up. If your family lived through something like this, an industrial disaster, a port accident, a day when the world changed fast, share your story in the comments. And if you want the next story in this series, you'll find it in the playlist. Because in American history, there are more mornings like this. Mornings that began ordinary and ended as something else entirely.